going away.
Yeah, I was just asking that and not a chance to read it.
Okay. It should be
working now. Having some very long conversations about TBC about whether or not introduce distributional tables, very complexity.
These are new bowls at Skewer. How do you like them? How do you like
Where's it from? It's good so far.
Especially when a lot of thousands of presidential
We have one of these with new food, and I'm just like, wait, where is this place? How far along? How far of a walk is it?
This is like next to Chapter. So.
Huh. I must have walked by it more times.
There's always some good amount of internal debate about that.
That is probably we're currently many places where BC is always very out.
56 periods.
We'll do.
I reckon 56 periods is not right.
It's like coding, like I'm so like.
I guess I don't even have to see it.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. I feel like yeah, there's always going to be different audiences.
And then you flip down to some technical things.
That's a little early.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
It's good.
I'm good.
And with the code itself, there's also a line in 3 different places. And how do you connect them all?
Yeah.
Because the brief code is interesting, but here. And so there's this kind of this.
So that it's
I think it's been out.
No.
We don't have any random that we discussed yet, but
So how long have you been at the
years. Working on it since like mostly stable and
cool.
I would write it back on
like for fellow science.
processing.
No, it's super wonderful. This is the super regular fun. Yeah, no, it's
One of the nice things
like that's great perspective.
is you very early in life that
So I
hard times.
was most recently at a research and advocacy organization called So I was there actually doing their
Hi. Good to see you again. How are you?
Very good. Thanks for coming.
Yes, excited to be here. It's usually that way, right?
Yeah,
It's somewhere that no alternative.
How long are you here?
Yeah, I'm going to Boston tomorrow and New York. So yeah, it's also just like a year assistant to look at
Also, works on the
yes,
oh, really fun.
that sounds like
We'll be able to go to some.
very much like I can do it so far.
Yes. Yeah, I think he I guess it's just starting this new stage in the program.
We are. So we're getting here people.
Weird
I didn't you never look at physical.
Yeah, no, exactly.
This man has a more like cooler case of you than I do, but he knows positions. So we're open to those jobs. Yeah, no, it's not hard. It's not hard.
But no, it's
this
always
worked out.
it's
That's great.
everyone
Sure.
there, and so kind of established so those two combined.
All right, let's get going. Honestly, we'll work make it a secret.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got lunch and water.
Yeah, I've got lunch and water here. So I'm good.
that
People are clearly very excited about.
What was that?
Usually people kind of like trickle in like right in front of their.
Oh, okay, okay.
About like a
Okay, that's
house
good.
and it's not even called Serena.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Everyone's
One of my
like
best
itching to
friends,
hear about.
Christian changed the way and flagged. That's why. Hopefully. Because I checked on his computer and it was like,
I was just seeing how this, how the two of them using to this.
definitely.
Got it.
Who's some of the other? I hope I.
no.
Undersecretary.
It checked on his computer, it's working.
Maybe it's me.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll check it on
So
mine.
he was, he's got to
But now I have to update my YouTube app.
There's also.
Oh, I'm so bad about it.
I've been unable to update my iOS for like 2 months now. Like every time I do, the phone's just like, nope,
No.
we can't.
Mine keeps on giving me a message letting me know that I failed to back it up. Like I know I failed to back you up phone because I don't back you up phone.
A lot of bouncing around.
So when you hear an explosion, it's just my phone like imploded for some reason.
Do you have an old phone
Yeah.
that can't handle that?
I'm just like I'm just paranoid about updating because I always think there's gonna be like some.
Oh yeah, because there often is some kind of thing.
Like the updates are like I was like, oh, bug fixes, and I'm like, does that mean like there's like huge security flaws?
Yeah.
Like, need all my information now, or is that just like an app?
Yes, I know. In advance of the
But you know,
Yeah.
the whole world already has our emails anyway.
The other former.
Oh.
But well,
Oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, I will not go into this without government.
so are we on live stream?
I'm sure it will be very exciting.
I don't know.
So you said you went to college in Portland?
Yeah,
I think so. I saw it on Christian's. I have no idea where it is. That's the thing.
It's hiding.
Yeah. It's hiding somewhere.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad we could come together.
There's a finance person, someone who works at the Fed, so he's sort of that now is
Even if it's not live streaming, we'll have a recording. So we can get the stuff.
I'm very excited that we're actually doing this stuff now because these are so awesome. It just feels like something. Only thing physically be there, but streaming.
Yeah. And then we'll be able to edit it.
Sometimes it's done quite good. Then it's like, just dub over it. Like, what about this? Very cool.
No. But sure, now that I got you to run back. Going. Are you coming back?
I'm just going to get food. Get something.
Do you have a YouTube channel? Have we always had a YouTube channel?
For a long time, but I don't know.
With nothing's been on it.
I know there's like videos of Heather.
Huh. Fascinating. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming today and for being so prompt. People are like clearly very excited to hear about macro from Neil. So our guest today is Neil Mehrotra, who is an Equitable Growth grantee. We always love it when we have grantees come to Washington and share their work in person with us and get to know people from the EG family as well as from the other places with whom we work. So we're really excited to have Neil here today. Neil's an assistant professor of economics at Brown, as well as an affiliate, apparently, with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, where they're doing really cool stuff on inequality and macro. Your presentation is not on that, but I'm kind of curious to hear some about that. He has lots of fancy degrees and worked at Goldman Sachs, which I found interesting. So we don't actually have all that many people in this room who have worked at Goldman. So that's a fun fact.
But it's just
badge of the devil or something.
Yeah. No, it might mean that you actually like know things about the world that aren't necessarily always in this room. So
2 degrees of separation from
Yeah.
Gary Cohen.
That's the next bench there.
That's, yeah, exactly.
So before I turn it over to Neil, a couple items of housekeeping. Again, I should introduce myself. I'm Elizabeth Jacobs. I am the research director and a senior fellow at Equitable Growth. I direct our academic grant making, which is part of why I'm so excited to have a grantee here. I am not a macroeconomist, as I told Neil, and every time I've talked to him, I'll just repeat that. I know a lot of things about economics, but macro is a space that I can't even pretend to know things about, so I'm very excited to have an hour to sit and learn with someone who's thinking about the economy in really interesting and creative ways. In terms of seminar business, we will not have a seminar in August because we know that many of you like to do things other than sit in a room and eat a free lunch in August, but we will be back in September. Lena Khan will be here on September 13th to talk about competition policy, and I think that should be really interesting. I hope you will all join us for that. We are also live streaming today. I think it's working. In theory, we're live streaming this talk, so know that your questions and comments and Neil's talk are going out to many people, all the many people who will visit our YouTube channel outside of this room. But we're very excited to now be live streaming. It means that if you're not able to attend the seminar in person, you still have an opportunity to sit and learn here.
No lunch.
But no lunch. Yeah, we can't live. You can watch people eat lunch, but we can't live stream you lunch.
Not yet.
Not yet. As usual, Neil's going to talk for about 45 minutes. I will leave it up to him as to whether he wants us to be rude economists and interrupt him along the way, or whether he wants to batch questions for later. But either way, we will leave about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. Neil has assured me that you all will have questions based on his talk, so get those ready. And we'll end promptly at 1:30 to give everyone the respect that their day deserves. So without further ado, Neil, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I will, like I said, I prefer questions throughout, so I'll try to keep 15 minutes at the end for questions, but please feel free to ask me questions. I know that there's a mix of people who are more and less familiar with macro, so it's getting questions in early is the best way to ensure that there's not too much confusion. This is before I start, I have to say that these are my own views. They do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis or the Federal Reserve System. I'm on sabbatical at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, so I have that disclaimer for a little while longer. All right, so we like to think a lot about the U.S. public debt, and a lot of people like to say they care about the level of the U.S. public debt. Whether anybody actually does or not is an open question. But the debt to GDP ratio in the U.S. is about now 70%. Obviously, it's higher when you take into account sort of future Medicare and Social Security obligations, entitlement obligations. But how should we think about whether the level of the U.S. debt is too high or not? Well, a common metric for thinking about debt sustainability is the divergence between the real interest rate on government debt and the growth rate of the economy. And so that's a common measure of debt sustainability, R minus G. And if you look historically at the U.S., what I'm plotting here in the blue line is a measure of the cost of servicing the public debt. And it'll be clear why R minus G is the right measure of servicing the public debt in a moment. But for the time being, just take my word for it. So the cost of servicing the public debt is approximately the difference between the real interest rate and the growth rate of the economy, which I've broken up into two components, the growth rate of real GDP per capita and the growth rate of the population. Okay? And the blue line plots that series back from 1870 to today, and I'm measuring the real interest rate here as the 10-year Treasury rate minus some moving average of inflation. And the red line here is just a 5-year moving average of the blue line, and what you should take away from this graph is that frequently over US history, it is the case that the cost of servicing the public debt is negative. So that means that effectively the government is being paid to borrow. It has no cost of borrowing. It has a negative cost of borrowing. And this is not something that is just true for the very distant past. This is something that's actually holds for most of the post-war period. So about 70% of the time in the post-war period, the cost of servicing the public debt has been negative. The only period in which it was noticeably positive was from around 1980 to the mid 1990s. So, in that sense, should we think about if on average the cost of servicing the public debt is negative, should we care that much about what the level of the public debt is? Because we're now entering a period again in which the cost of servicing the debt is negative. Real interest rates minus the growth rate of the economy today is negative. The cost of borrowing for the U.S. government is very low. But the other thing to notice about this graph is that there are swings in the cost of servicing the debt. There are periods in which the cost of servicing the debt can become positive, and should there be a big rise in real interest rates, that can be problematic if you have a large stock of public debt. So what actually happens is in a world in which the real interest rate is less than the growth rate of the economy, the government can actually raise revenue by issuing debt, right? So all things being equal, if you live in this world, and holding these things constant, as you issue more and more government debt, you collect essentially a premium from doing that, and you can use that to either increase government spending or reduce taxes, right? Which is quite attractive, given the difficulties we have in sort of raising taxes or changing around government expenditures. But however, this strategy can be risky. So why is this strategy risky? Running with a high stock of public debt makes you susceptible to these interest rate reversals. So if interest rates suddenly jump up, suddenly to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio, you have to engage in a pretty sizable fiscal consolidation. And the size of that fiscal consolidation obviously scales with the level of debt. The larger the debt is, the bigger that risk is. So what I do in this paper is I want to bring some empirical evidence on the level and variability of debt servicing costs, just historically, and think about, given today that we're in a low interest rate world, what's the risk going forward of reverting to a higher interest rate world? So how risky is a strategy of a high level of government debt? And we typically don't think of these things as sort of determined independently, so I'm going to build a model, macroeconomic model, to think about how this debt servicing cost evolves under various secular stagnation scenarios. So we have various theories for what accounts for low real interest rates. If I think about what might be some of the candidate drivers for low real interest rates, given some perturbations to that, what is the effect on the cost of servicing the debt? And so what I think what this analysis reveals is, I think, a couple of very interesting facts. First of all, on average, the cost of servicing the public debt is negative. And this is not just true for the US, this is true for a broader range of advanced economies over a fairly long period of time. You can slice these periods in different ways, but the cost of servicing the debt is typically negative. However, there is substantial variability in this cost of servicing debt. So it is true that running a high debt to GDP ratio based on the basis that the government can collect this extra revenue is a risky strategy, in that you can encounter these periods of high fiscal cost. And the probability of reversion, even for a country like the US, is still fairly moderate. So if I look over the next 5 or 10 years, just based off the historical record, there is sort of a moderate probability of reverting to a period in which R becomes greater than G. Now, what I find in my model is that using the model, and thinking about sort of the current period in time, Slower population growth, if there's a further reduction in population growth from where it is, and population growth is expected to slow down gradually over the next 10, 15 years, slower population growth is going to worsen debt sustainability. Now, why is it not obvious that slower growth, why is it not clear that slower growth would always do this? Well, slower growth has a direct effect. It lowers economic growth rates, right? Slower population growth lowers economic growth rates, but it also has an effect on the real interest rate. And so the theoretical effect is ambiguous, right? It could go the opposite direction. But what happens is that a decline in population growth rates, it has some effect on the real interest rate, but it has a stronger effect, direct effect on economic growth. That effect dominates, and so the cost of servicing the public debt goes up as population growth falls. The opposite is true actually for productivity growth, though. So if productivity growth further slows down, and this is what's sort of counterintuitive, a decline in productivity growth will actually improve debt sustainability. And why is that? Well, a decline in productivity growth is again going to have a direct effect on lowering economic growth rates, but it has an indirect effect on the real interest rate, and that indirect effect on the real interest rate can be quite strong. And if it's strong enough, that effect dominates, and what happens is the real interest rate falls faster than economic growth rates, and so you have an improvement in the cost of servicing the debt.
You're slower. The definition of slower is that with respect to current levels or with respect to some absolute.
This is all going to be done relative to current levels. I'm going to take my model, I'm going to try to calibrate it to the current economic environment, and then think about variations around the current level. Yeah.
So you mentioned, sorry if you mentioned this, the real interest rate, is that some kind of long-term interest rate or just?
The real interest rate is just nominal interest rates minus the inflation rate. So, so you can think of this all as, again, it's equivalent to saying the cost of servicing government debt is the nominal interest rate minus the nominal growth rate of the economy, which is inflation plus real GDP growth. It's all the same thing.
Before you dive deeper into the details, could you contrast your framework with one that I always thought was the dominant way to measure debt, and that's debt as a percentage of GDP, the relative interest rate for the relative. Is that in contrast to your approach, or is it?
So from my perspective, the overall level of the debt to GDP ratio, it does matter, and it will matter for things like capital accumulation. But when we think about debt sustainability, it's really about how much extra taxes do you need just to pay the interest cost on that debt, and does that become prohibitively large? And so what we're saying here is that actually, in a world where R is less than G, it can be the case that increasing the debt to GDP ratio even higher will actually generate more resources in a way that I'll show you in a second. So despite R being less than G, what I find in my model is actually the revenue maximizing level of debt is actually a little bit lower than what it is today. And it again has to do with the fact that in the model, the interest rate is endogenous. And so reducing the debt to GDP ratios from levels that it is today to a slightly lower level, it has a direct effect of lowering the stock of debt, but it has which is not beneficial in an R minus G, in an R less than G world, but it has an indirect effect of further lowering the real interest rate, and that effect actually seems to dominate. So so the point here is that it's important to think about what are the forces that are driving real interest rates, because they can have implications for how we think about debt sustainability. Now, what would be then the takeaways for monetary and fiscal policy? I think overall the analysis suggests that it's unclear that fiscal policy has a lot of increased space to take on much more debt. So there is some sort of sense in which the debt to GDP ratio, it might be preferable to gradually lower the debt to GDP ratio. And it also suggests that when we think about how to avoid the zero lower bound problem, how to think about monetary policy in a world with low interest rates, if fiscal policy is sort of up against this constraint because public debt is too high, raising the inflation target may be a superior way to deal with the zero lower bound, rather than trying to increase the public debt and increase real interest rates. There's been some debate about that in the secular stagnation literature. All right. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the literature. There's just there is a literature on sources of low interest rates, which we've contributed to, but yeah, I'll leave aside the other literature unless people have any specific questions. All right. So there's going to be sort of three parts of the talk: the empirical facts, going through a quantitative life cycle model, and then thinking about some of the results that I get out of this quantitative model. All right. So where does this notion that R minus G is a good way to think about debt sustainability come from? Well, let's start with this first equation. This first equation is just an accounting relationship. It's the government's flow budget constraint. What it says is that taxes plus new debt issued has to cover government spending plus repaying previous period debt inclusive of interest. Okay, very simple relationship, holds in any economic model. Now, in a world in which in a world where you want to keep the debt to GDP ratio constant, but in a world in which productivity and population are growing, then we can adjust this relationship to find a steady state relationship between taxes, government spending, and the public debt. And so what I'm doing here is I'm just dividing through this equation by the current level of productivity and the current population. And when you take into account growth rates, what you get is that along the balanced growth path, so in an economy with a constant debt to GDP ratio, with a constant real interest rate, it'll have to be the case that taxes cover government spending plus the interest costs of servicing the debt. And this is where the R minus G minus N stuff comes in. What it says is that if real interest rates are higher than the growth rate of the economy, this term is positive, right? And if this term is positive, as you increase the level of public debt, this is the debt to GDP ratio, as you increase the debt to GDP ratio higher and higher, that means that you have to raise taxes in excess of government spending in order to just pay those interest costs. But that relationship completely reverses when R falls less than G. And so if R is less than G plus N here, then this term will be negative. And what happens is that increases in the public debt will actually generate a windfall for the government. Further increases in public debt will allow you to either reduce taxes below government spending or increase government spending for a given level of taxes. So it generates fiscal resources for the government. All right. So what I want to do is I want to think about this object and how it behaves historically. So I have constructed a data set. Well, I have not constructed a data set. I've used a data set that's constructed by Jorda, Schulerich, and Taylor. They recently made available a cross-country historical macroeconomic data set. They did a lot of work on this data set. It's a great data set. And I'm going to use this data set to think about the behavior of R minus G minus N in 17 advanced economies. Now, their data set is going to cover the usual actors, the US, Japan, UK, and Germany, but it's also going to include countries that you might think are fiscally less responsible, countries like Italy, countries like Portugal. So it's a pretty broad-based data set, but it's 17 advanced economies. I'm going to measure real interest rates here as a nominal interest rate on a long-term government bond. Their data set doesn't specify what the long-term government debt is, and so it's not. I don't have a measure of the effective cost of debt, which is what you might want, but I'm going to proxy for that using a long-term government bond. This is probably a fairly conservative assumption. And then for the real interest rate, I'm going to take. I'm going to subtract this nominal interest rate. I'm going to subtract the 3-year moving average of inflation from the nominal interest rate, and this results in an unbalanced panel of about 2,100 country year observations.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
What maturity are you using, and how do you think about the maturity structure?
So I'm using a long-term government bond, and I will, yeah, I'm using a long-term government bond. They don't specify the maturity of it. In the case of the U.S., it's a 10-year, and so that's probably fairly conservative for that. That's going to overestimate the cost of servicing the debt for the U.S. I don't know what they're using for other countries. They just generally have a short-term and long-term rate, so I use the long-term rate. Maturity structure is an important question. It'll be more relevant for my model when you're thinking about sort of the risk of changes in changes in real interest rates and whether the government's insulated against that. And so that's going to be a caveat to what I'll show you. But I have not yet incorporated a longer-term maturity structure. In the model, it's one period then. All right. So this is a set of just means from this data set. This will give you the median 25th and 75th percentile for 17 advanced countries and for the United States. Everything here is quite standard. You can see that for the U.S., for example, the long-term nominal interest rate in this data set is about 4%. The median inflation rate is about 2%, a little bit less than 2%. And I'll give you a real interest rate of 2.7. The real GDP growth rate over this period is about per capita. This is per capita growth is 1.91%. Population growth about 1.4, and a debt to GDP ratio of 35% for the U.S. These numbers are again fairly a little bit higher in the advanced countries. It's worth noting that today U.S. population growth is in the bottom quartile of sort of these historical averages. So U.S. population growth rate today is 0.7%, which is below the 25th percentile, and the debt to GDP ratio for the U.S. is in the top quartile. So if you just naively looking at this data, you would suggest that we have a problem in the sense that population is growing slowly and the debt to GDP ratio is kind of high. The only mitigating factor here is that real interest rates are very low. Real interest rates are also in the bottom quartile. Okay, so what this table shows is a measure of net fiscal cost, R minus G minus N, for the entire data set and for the U.S. in particular. So notice that the median cost of servicing the debt for all the countries over this period is approximately 0. And if we just look at the post-war period, this cost is slightly negative. For the U.S., it's quite a bit negative, especially in the post-war period. The cost of servicing the debt was about negative 1.4% from over the post-war period. There is, however, a fairly sizable interquartile range. So the interquartile range over this period is about 5 percentage points. It narrows slightly in the post-war period, and it's all shifted slightly lower for the U.S. So the U.S. seems to enjoy lower interest rates than the rest of the world. That's sometimes called the exorbitant privilege. Now I've computed this measure using 5-year averages. So I'm taking 5-year periods and trying to smooth out business cycles and so forth. Just trying to think about over a sort of 5-year period of time, what is the cost of servicing the public debt? That's how you get these sort of numbers of observations. The other thing I look at is just the fraction of time that the cost of servicing the public debt is negative, and the fraction for which the cost of servicing the public debt is very negative, is less than 2%. And you can see that for the U.S., in this post-war period, again taking 5-year averages, 70% of these 5-year periods are periods in which the cost of servicing the debt is negative. For the world as a whole, it's around 50% of the time, so about half the time you will have a negative cost of servicing the debt, and nearly a third of the time it'll be very negative. It'll be something like negative 2%. So just looking at the sort of averages here, you might think that that governments would want to take advantage of the fact that the cost of servicing the debt can be negative over long periods of time.
What percentage of time is it very positive?
So this is approximately symmetric. So my guess is it would probably be about 25–30% of the time. on the other side as well. So it's not. You're right. There is a little bit of skewness here. So for the U.S., it's much less because this thing at the 75th percentile, it's not much more than 1%. But for the rest of the world, for the world overall, it's much more symmetric.
There's wars and stuff like that. Very huge.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I again look at also the post-war period. In the paper, I also strip out the Great Depression and the World Wars, but it doesn't really change anything. So the next thing I do here though is, okay, on average the cost of servicing the debt is negative. What is the probability over the next 5 or 10 years that you revert to a state of the world in which the cost of servicing the public debt becomes positive? The way I'm going to formalize this is I'm going to estimate a probit regression. And I'm going to estimate a probit asking what's the probability that over the next 5 or 10 years that the cost of servicing the public debt turns positive, and I'm going to use the current cost of servicing the public debt, population growth, and the debt to GDP ratio as possible predictors for the likelihood of switching to a positive cost of servicing the debt over the next 5 or 10 years. So what I find from this regression, the first 2 columns are for just 1 period forward, 5 years forward. The next 2 columns are for 2 periods forward, 10 years forward in the data set. And I'm asking then, and then what's the difference between each of the 2 columns? Well, one is columns 2 and 5 are estimated on the full data set. Columns 3 and 6 are estimated on just the post-war period. And what it says here is that the current value of the cost of servicing the public debt is a statistically significant predictor for whether in the next 5 or 10 years the cost of servicing the public debt turns positive. So that means that there's some autocorrelation essentially in this process. The debt to GDP ratio doesn't seem to matter at all. So the debt to GDP ratio you might expect to be a predictor for whether the cost of servicing the public debt turns positive. It turns out that it has no correlation with the probability of switching to a positive cost environment. The effect of population growth is a bit ambiguous. It's significant in the full sample, insignificant in the post-war sample, although the coefficients are generally stable. But the other thing to take away from this regression is that the R-squareds are fairly low. So what that means is that there's a lot of variability that is not being explained by these covariates. And I've worked with other sort of specifications, but it says that there's a lot of residual variation in real interest rates that the model or that this regression framework is just not picking up.
So the lack of relationship with debt to GDP ratio is really interesting because the standard story you hear in fiscal policy about why are deficits finance, tax cuts, or spending increases, why is that bad for the economy in the long run is crowding out.
Yeah, sure.
And this seems like it's throwing some cold water on it.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's very difficult to find debt to GDP ever predicting things like crowding out, predicting things like higher real interest rates, and so that bears out in the same regression.
Right, I mean that's a conventional wisdom. Everyone knows that that's true.
No,
it's not.
Well, I mean, we have good reasons in theory to think that it should be true, and there might be several confounding factors here. For example, the debt to GDP ratio was quite high coming out of World War II, so some of this stuff may be driven by just what's happening in World War in the immediate post-war years. But that's an important thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
Wait, is Japan part of this?
Yes. Japan is part of this data set. Yeah.
And so, am I interpreting this correctly that if you go from 0 to Japan,
yes,
you're roughly decreasing the probability
on the point estimate,
by about 30. It's just very noisy.
Yeah, sure.
Which is probably related to the post-war.
Yeah, no, that's true. So the point estimate's negative, but yeah, poorly estimated. So one way of interpreting these probit regressions is to just think about what are the fitted values for the US today. So if I take the current cost of servicing the public debt, I take current population growth, I take the current debt to GDP ratio, what is my empirical model predicting for the probability of switching in the next 5 or 10 years to a positive cost of servicing the debt? And so just using these current values, the probabilities that I get are not that different from just the unconditional probabilities. So what that's saying is that there's a 45% probability of going to a positive cost in the next 5 years, a 51% probability of going to a positive cost over the next 10 years. Those are very close to the unconditional averages. And so even though the cost of servicing public debt is negative today in the US, it's not negative enough, and the current constellation of population growth is not going to really move these probabilities around all that much. Now, if you think that the underlying growth rate of G, which is real GDP per capita, which is, again, productivity growth along the balanced growth path, if you think that actually we're going to revert to something closer to mid-1990s productivity growth rates, well, then these probabilities do drop. And so, but they don't drop all that much, really. There's still a sizable likelihood of shifting to a world in which there's a positive cost of servicing the public debt. And if you take a more pessimistic view on productivity, then you get even higher probabilities. But what's surprising is these probabilities actually don't move around all that much. And the fiscal costs associated with a shift to a higher R minus G world can be sizable. So if I take the median post-war level for conditional on there being a positive fiscal cost, this is it's 1.7%. If you think about something somewhat higher at 3%, the fiscal costs associated are between 1 and 2% of GDP. A 1 to 2% of GDP fiscal consolidation is a pretty sizable fiscal consolidation. Historical debt deficit reduction measures, in the 1990s and so forth, were at most usually about 1%. The more recent, whatever it's called, the Budget Control Act was I think about 0.5% of GDP. So I think the message coming from these regressions is that there is a moderate probability of reversion to a higher cost of servicing the public debt. The last thing that I think is worth looking at that may be of interest in the data is that we can compare we can think about, in a world with slower growth, what's the effect on the cost of servicing the public debt. So what I'm plotting here is population growth, and here's real GDP per capita growth. On the y-axis is the cost of servicing the public debt. And there's a weak relationship between population growth and the cost of servicing the public debt in the over this period. So as population growth slows, it does become more expensive to service the public debt. But there's a much stronger relationship with GDP per capita. Slow GDP per capita growth, and again, we're in a period of slow GDP per capita growth, there is a substantially higher cost of servicing the public debt. Now, these are just correlations that are taken from the data set. All right, so far, what I've told you is just a set of facts on the behavior of real interest rates minus the growth rate of the economy, so this object R minus G minus N. In macroeconomic theory, there are strong reasons to believe that real interest rates are going to be tightly related to whatever's the underlying drivers of growth in the economy. And so it's not clear that you just want to think about those in a purely reduced form way. So I'm going to go to a quantitative life cycle model that will allow me to think about what are the underlying drivers of slow growth and how do they feed into to lower real interest rates. And then you can think about, so essentially I'm going to endogenize the real interest rate with my model, and I'm going to ask the question that with slower productivity growth or with slower population growth, what is the effect on this object? Now, this object again is the cost of servicing the public debt, And what's endogenous here now is the real interest rate. So the real interest rate is now going to be a function, in part, of the growth rate of productivity, the growth rate of the population. It's also going to depend on this variable omega. This variable omega is supposed to pick up another cause of low interest rates, or allow for another mechanism by which interest rates are low, and that's the sort of flight to safety hypothesis. So an influential strand of literature from Emmanuel Fari and other co-authors argues that real interest rates are low today primarily because not all returns are low in the economy, but because investors have a preference for safe assets. And so that safety premium is what's driving down real interest rates. And so I'll be able to think about variations in this object. What effect does that have on the cost of servicing the debt? The other thing that will generally be true is that you generally think that changes in the debt to GDP ratio are going to also affect the real interest rate. So now the debt to GDP ratio has a direct effect on the cost or benefit of servicing the public debt, but it has an indirect effect through the real interest rate. So I'm going to I'm trying to build sort of a quantitatively realistic model. It's going to be a 56-period life cycle model. These are the kind of models that people use at the CBO for thinking about Social Security, thinking about Medicare. These are the kind of models that were used in sort of the late 1980s when people were first concerned about debt sustainability. So it's a common way to think about how the public debt affects other macroeconomic aggregates. And so what's going to make this model more realistic is that households face sort of a life cycle profile of income. They have a life cycle motive for savings, so they're going to want to save when they're young for retirement. They're also going to face some mortality risk and take that into account in the decisions that they make. And I can use that to explore the underlying drivers of low interest rates. I'm going to calibrate this model to try to match some key moments of the U.S. data. I'm going to try to match the U.S. labor share, the investment to output ratio, the real interest rate, and some measure of risk premium. So I'm going to try to make some now sort of quantitatively realistic statements using this model. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip through the actual sort of guts of the model that I might present in a more extended seminar. I'll just sort of lay through the environment for you. Time is going to be discrete. There's going to be a single consumption. There's going to be two types of goods: a consumption and investment good. And households are going to live for capital J periods, so there's going to be J representative cohorts of households, and there's going to be a single representative firms. There's going to be two types of assets that are vehicles in which households can save. They can save in physical capital, and they can save in government bonds. And those assets are going to earn the same rate of return. Households are going to face an age-specific borrowing constraint, and they're also going to have sort of an age-specific profile for their human capital, and that's the way in which we capture the fact that that wages and income are rising over one's life cycle. All right, I'm going to just skip through these equations, and first highlight sort of one difference between the class of model that I'm working with and the typical class of model that's used in macroeconomics. So the typical model that's used in macroeconomics is going to use a representative agent. And the representative agent household has important advantages, but it has important limitations. In the representative agent framework, there's a really simple equation for real interest rate determination. Real interest rates in the representative household model are going to just depend on the growth rate of the economy, so the growth rate of productivity, and it's going to depend on the household's level of patience. So beta is a measure of how impatient a household is. In this world, in a representative agent benchmark, Ricardian equivalence hold, so public debt is irrelevant, and the real interest rate is independent of population growth. So it's a much less interesting environment for thinking about things for thinking about the issues that we want to think about here. It's one of the reasons for using the quantitative life cycle model. For those of you who are familiar, it's also a world in which the economy is dynamically efficient, where it always has to be the case that R is greater than G plus N. And what we saw in the data is that that's not true, right? There's often periods in which R is less than G plus N. All right, so I'm going to skip these slides. It's just some qualitative predictions of the model, and I'll go to the model results in the last 5-10 minutes. All right, so I calibrate the model to try to fit the data as best as I can. I'm using a mortality profile that comes from the CDC. I'm using an income profile that comes from an important paper by Pierre-Olivier Grinchas and Jonathan Parker. I'm setting the population growth rate and the productivity growth rate to current levels in the US. So each of these is about 0.7. And I'm going to set government spending at the sort of past 10-year average, 19.2% of GDP, and public debt at 70% of GDP. There's two important parameters here in my model: the elasticity of intertemporal substitution, which just measures how sensitive the real interest rate is to changes in growth, and that comes from how households respond to changes in their growth in the path of consumption growth. And the depreciation rate is just how quickly capital dies off. I pick an intermediate value here. And what am I targeting? I'm setting a set of parameters in order to match exactly these targets. So I'm going to set my real interest rate at 0.54%. Where do I get this? This is just the 10-year Treasury rate minus the inflation rate over the last 5 years. And so it's positive, but it's pretty small. I'll set a risk premium to measure to match the spread between corporate debt and 10-year Treasury rates, investment to output ratio of 17%, and a labor share of 60%. And that delivers me a set of parameters that are broadly in line with the literature. Okay, so this is one key sort of takeaway from the model. What I'm doing here is I'm varying the population growth rate between 0 and 2%, and I'm varying the productivity growth rate between 0 and 2%, and I'm asking, what does my model predict for the behavior of the real interest rate? And what you should notice from these lines, the gray line here is just a 45-degree line that goes through the point at which this model is calibrated. And what this is telling you is that the blue line has a slope less than 1, right? Why does that matter? Well, that matters because if population growth rates go down, that means that it has an effect on the real interest rate that's less than 1 for 1. And so the direct effect dominates the indirect effect. And with slower population growth, you get a higher cost of servicing the public debt. The opposite happens with faster population growth. Faster population growth will raise the real interest rate, but not as quickly as it raises growth. So you have this asymmetry with population growth. The opposite happens for productivity growth. For productivity growth, the slope of this line is greater than 1. Slower productivity growth is beneficial because it reduces the real interest rate faster than its direct effect on economic growth. The opposite happens with faster productivity growth. A faster productivity growth is going to have a big effect on the real interest rate. It's going to drive up the cost of servicing the public debt. So you can also think about changes in this intermediation wedge. This intermediation wedge is less interesting as the intermediation wedge becomes smaller. That's also going to raise real interest rates, and it has no effect on growth. So that's always going to be bad from a sort of fiscal sustainability standpoint. So we can go through different scenarios, and let's say that productivity accelerates back to its 1990s levels. If productivity in the US accelerated back to its 1990s levels, my model says that there should be a fiscal consolidation of about 5 to 8 percentage points of GDP, 0.5 to 0.8 percentage points of GDP in order to keep the debt to GDP ratio stable. So at a 70% debt to GDP ratio, you need a fiscal consolidation that's on the order of what the Budget Control Act was. If you have a fall in population growth to 0.5%, that's also going to require fiscal consolidation, but quantitatively it's quite small. By contrast, if you had a productivity slowdown or if you had a rise in population growth, back to say 1990s levels, you would create more fiscal growth. You would create, the movements in real interest rates would be such that you would be able to raise more government resources, about 0.4% of GDP. It's important that if we think about economic policy today and we just take its aims at face value, the sort of tax cuts, deregulation stuff is again supposed to accelerate productivity growth. The anti-immigration stuff is supposed to reduce population growth. From the constellation, so the combination of those sort of policies is going to be fiscally, at least through the lens of this model, it's going to require fiscal consolidation. They're going to tend to raise real interest rates relative to growth rates. A decline in risk premia back to its 1980s averages is also going to require a slight fiscal consolidation. Now, what is this graph showing? What this graph is showing is how the level of taxation varies with changes in the debt to GDP ratio. Now, notice that this is a pretty big range for the debt to GDP ratio, 40% to 120% of GDP. And what you notice here is that this is a fairly flat line. So this is, again, consistent with some of those regressions that the debt to GDP ratio can vary quite a bit and have fairly weak effects on both real interest rates and on debt sustainability over this period. But what this graph also shows is that actually the tax minimizing level of debt to GDP is actually slightly lower. So a decline in the debt to GDP ratio from 70% to 60% will actually raise more revenue. And why is that the case? Even though R is less than G, if you go back to, this equation, if R is less than G, you might want to try to jack up BG in order to, the debt to GDP ratio in order to generate more resources for the government, but that has an indirect effect on R. And what it's saying is actually, given the level of debt to GDP that we have today, my model is saying that actually you want to lower the debt to GDP ratio because the benefit from R is, from a lower R is even better. Yeah.
On your assumption of government spending as a percentage of GDP seems very low, at 20%. Are you looking at just federal?
Government purchases. I'm looking at government purchases as a share of total income. So I'm not thinking about transfers.
Or you're not?
So I'm just taking government consumption as a share of
federal and state.
Yes, federal and state. But
your debt is just federal. Your debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah, so this is approximating the fact that states are supposed to run balanced budgets, right? I mean, there's other liabilities that they have, right? No, that's true. All right. All right. So I'm going to just end with this slide here. What do I think are the key takeaways? On average, the cost of servicing the debt is frequently negative, but this servicing cost shows substantial variability and sort of a moderate likelihood of reverting to positive fiscal cost in the medium term. Slower population and productivity growth, I think it's kind of interesting that they carry the opposite implications for the cost of servicing the debt. So we need to think hard about what's pushing down both economic growth and real interest rates. And even though R is less than G plus N, in my model, the revenue maximizing level of debt is lower. But the overall sort of sensitivity of taxation to changes in the public debt is not all that high. There's important for sort of limitations to what I've shown you so far. There is no sense in which R minus G minus G plus N is a sufficient statistic for the optimal level of debt. Actually, thinking about the optimal level of debt in this class of models is quite complicated. It's going to depend on all the shocks that hit the model. It's going to depend on the costs of distortionary taxation, the degree to which the capital stock is crowded out by the public debt. So there's no sense in which this is an optimal level. This is any recommendation about the optimal level of debt. It says from a very narrow perspective for a government that just cares about debt sustainability, how should they think of that? So, thank you.
Is it valid and useful to differentiate among different types of federal debt? I've heard people say debt we owe to ourselves, like the Social Security Trust Fund, should be looked at differently than debt we owe to foreign nations. Is there any validity to that?
I think there's a sense in which, so I have not included Social Security in this analysis, and the model here is an entirely closed economy. So in some sense, the debt is all owed to yourself, in the sense that there's a set of taxes that you could raise that would immediately lower the debt to GDP ratio to 0. So I think the open economy stuff might be more interesting. So there might be a useful distinction between debt that we owe to ourselves versus debt. What percentage of our debt is held by foreigners. But that's not something that I've taken into account here. But I think conceptually, at least, it matters more than the Social Security thing. Yeah.
So I also find the differential effects of like population and productivity growth really interesting, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on like why that is, like what's driving that, because I can't.
If you go back to sort of the representative agent model, so even though this is a life cycle model, it does behave in some ways like the representative agent model. In the representative agent model, the sensitivity of real interest rates to population is 0, right? And so that weakens with the life cycle model. You start to get more effects from changes in the age structure when people have finite lives.
Gotcha.
But I guess that approximation still holds, that there's a weak relationship between real interest rates and population growth. Now, if I look at productivity growth, in that model, the relationship between the real interest rate and productivity growth is driven entirely by this parameter, the elasticity of intertemporal substitution. And that parameter, typically we think of as less than 1. There's some debate about it, but there's quite a bit of evidence from asset pricing and from other studies that parameter is less than 1. And that's the parameter. As long as it's less than 1, then qualitatively the effect that I show you here is going to go through. That means that real interest rates are going to be more sensitive to growth. They're going to move more than 1 for 1 with a change in productivity growth. Now, a lot of that is driven by households' anticipations about the future, and so to the extent that changes in productivity growth are not really anticipated by households, then you can have then you don't really get that effect. So this G effect is much more not about productivity growth per se, but about households' anticipations.
Gotcha.
In the model, they're the same thing, but in
so like
real life, they might be different, right?
Gotcha.
I don't, the way households think about.
So it's like a shift in optimism.
Yeah.
Population changes are like hard to like be shocked by, but then productivity growth could like. Yeah,
because again, to the extent you could have no change in productivity growth, but you could have just changes in people's the way they think about the future, and arguably that's what's happening in the Great Recession. Right? That people are becoming much more pessimistic about the future. I mean, there's a little bit of a literature and asset pricing that sort of argues this, and that would be consistent with would have the same sort of effects.
Can you talk about the implications for monetary policy from the beginning? Keep setting a higher inflation target. My understanding of the zero lower bound problem is that it makes it hard for monetary policy to achieve a higher inflation target than
well, it's worth clarifying that the Federal Reserve has not bothered to change its inflation target, right? They've not tried to do that. Now, I think there is a question that one of the reasons they don't want to do that is because they're not sure how to do it. They're not sure how to achieve higher inflation, right? They can't get it now. So if they say, okay, we're going to go to a 4% inflation target, no one's going to believe them, and then they're going to lose credibility and whatnot. So one of the issues so here the real interest rate, the way I've calibrated the model, is fairly close to 0, right? And so then you think that in recessions you're going to run up against the 0 lower bound. The model here has no business cycle shocks, but you're going to run up against the 0 lower bound much more often. So one solution to that, that's the solution that Summers has sort of advocated, is to try to use fiscal policy to raise the real interest rate so that we have more space to get away from the 0 lower bound. Another solution is to raise the inflation target so that we can get to negative interest rates much more easily. And for various, so there's a debate about which of these is better. My model is just saying from a sort of fiscal standpoint, you might want to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, which is all things going to equal, it's going to lower the real interest rate. That's going to worsen the 0 lower bound problem unless you do something else. And the other thing to do there is to raise the inflation target. But that assumes that the central bank, that the Fed could be successful in raising the inflation target, and there's there's reasons to worry about that.
So the results you have on the relationship between population growth and productivity growth and that sustainability of our model is.
Yes.
What is the empirical evidence on this? Is there
So I haven't. I could look at this in the data. I don't have productivity growth in the data. I would need to try to isolate it. My guess is that there's a weak relationship between real interest rates and population growth. I would guess that the same thing is true for productivity growth. So our models suggest a very strong relationship between the two, but I believe that the literature has had a hard time piecing that out. And I think it might have to do with something that we were talking about, that the reason that the real interest rate is so connected to the productivity growth rate in the models is because it's very much through expectations, right? It's through how households think about their path of consumption, right? And there's no reason to think that in a rational expectations world, those things have to line up, but in the real world, I don't think people think about their future. They don't think about, okay, what's the next 10 years going to look like for wages or whatever, based off of what historical productivity growth is. So
you don't think that way?
No, that's special.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Neil. This was fantastic. I want to note that Janet Yellen is testifying today. I don't know if she already has, but I know that I will look at her testimony with a slightly different lens than I would have before. So I'm very grateful to you. And also, I always try and thank Nisha and Christian and the other Equitable Growth folks who do a huge amount of work to make this seminar happen. So thank them very much. I took this seminar over from our former research director, and it's been so easy, which is great because it means that other people are doing great work. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope it was